Well, the political conventions for 2024 are now finished. They are over. But what did we learn about America? That's the topic today on The Public Square with Dave Zanotti and the team. The team consists of our producer, Alan C. Duncan, Rob Walgate, Melanie Elsey, and Dr. Jeff Sanders. Let's get started. We have a very special guest joining us, and Dave will introduce Dr. William B. Allen here to the conversation. Dave?
So the conventions have come and they have gone, and now people are doing the dissection, the dissertations, the analysis. Some are running away as fast as they can. It's a trying experience to watch through all of that. On 1850 Main Street, our conversation has sort of come down to the conclusion that we each experienced 4 days of infomercials, which obviously is something that in part of American political life and dialogue, people have the right to produce and people have the right to watch or to turn away from. Recently, the Associated Press published a story by Ted Anthony. And Mr. Anthony, the headline of the story said this: "Behind the rhetoric, a presidential campaign is a competition about how to tell the American story." And that really piqued my attention because several of the things that I tripped over in the conventions were the telling of the story and the lack thereof and the terms that were used or the nuances. So I thought that perhaps the best way to do this, so I don't go flying off the handle, because I'm tempted to do that on this stuff because the American story means a lot to all of us around here. I thought I'd bring in our veteran trustee and, in my mind, the person who can best put this in context, Dr. William B. Allen. So, Dr. Allen, thank you for joining me today for a therapy session.
Oh, delighted to be with you.
So let's start with the headline. Behind the rhetoric, a presidential campaign is a competition about how to tell the American story. You've seen a lot of presidential elections, a lot of campaigns. You've run for the U.S. Senate yourself. You have been advisor to and confidant of many people who are political figures, along with being a professor of the American story for your whole life. Let's talk about that headline, a competition to tell the American story. How are the parties doing in that telling?
Well, it's an interesting question to raise because if you ask that from the point of view of proper historical analysis, you would have to conclude that neither party does it particularly well. But that's probably asking for too much from politics. What we really care about, it seems to me, is how well do they invoke the prestige of the story? And do they do it honestly? Those are the two questions. And what is the prestige of the American story? Well, sometimes it's called American exceptionalism. But all that really means is there was from the beginning, in the founding of the United States, a commitment to very high purposes. And the question is whether those who today invoke it seem at all cognizant, aware, knowledgeable about those high purposes. So when you put it that way, then the question is, do they reflect genuine understanding when they invoke the American story? I recently was asked to write a short piece to answer the question, can civic education save our institutions? And my response was no, it cannot. Because if the institutions are hollowed out, there are no citizens to direct the civic education. And that's what we're dealing with when you ask me about these competing American stories. Are they hollowed out stories? Are they stories filled with the treasures of the past? And I conclude that they are hollowed out stories. They neither understand the critical decisions that were made in the hours of revolution and founding, nor are faithful to them, at least in one case. Now, I'll just illustrate this. You and I have talked about what happened to the 1619 Project. And we both know that many of the people who were present in last week's convention were people who embraced the 1619 Project. And that project had one message, namely, that the story of America is slavery. And what did we see repeated throughout the convention all week last week? Freedom. They claimed that the story was freedom. Were they speaking honestly or dishonestly? I think the best thing for us to say is what they did in the Democrat convention in telling the story was to put their true beliefs into a cryogenic suspension. They have frozen it until after the election. And so they were lying when they invoke freedom because they don't really believe it. So the question of the competition between the two is the question between truth and falsity.
Kamala Harris talked about the American story being the most extraordinary story in all of history. That perked up my attention because I do, much thanks to you and the study that we have done, that I have sat under your teaching with great joy in our master's studies in history, studying presidential speeches and studying personalities and how all of this flows. I went back to British historian Paul Johnson's work, The History of the American People. And in the opening of the book, he has this statement, which I've tried hard to memorize. It's one of those that doesn't seem to stick in my mind, so I keep it nearby. I have it right on my phone because it seems to come up so often. Johnson starts his narrative, if you will, of the American story with these words: "The creation of the United States of America is the greatest of all human adventures. No other national story holds such tremendous lessons for the American people themselves and for the rest of mankind." That particular statement speaks very deeply to me because it takes us back to the understanding of the uniqueness of people attempting to do what the people who came to America tried to accomplish. I come back to the very humblest of beginnings and the first people who came here to America who didn't come with the endorsement of the billionaire class, who didn't come as representatives of gigantic interests. They came here stumbling and struggling, many in exile for religious freedom. And they died here. It didn't go very well. The first starts in America were harsh. They were not things to write home to mom about. And people had to dig this out of the ground. But from the very beginning, from the Mayflower, from the very beginning of the Mayflower Compact, from the very beginning of when I go to the ruins of Jamestown, all right, I see the fact that the first church, the first civic meetings that happened, the civil meetings, the city councils and magisterial meetings that happened in the United States happened in a church. That was the only building they had that basically handled everything. I think of all of these testaments and testimonies of the beginning of our nation as an expression of religious liberty and conscience. And it was impossible for America to exist without, the sense of personal responsibility. These people were dying in the snow. This was no picnic. And to think that from these most humble, staggering beginnings, what would emerge would be the creation of a republic with such depth and such strength and such uniqueness and such transcendent power. To me, I have to agree with Johnson. I'm totally captured by the story. It's the most amazing story that of human experience and human adventure ever told. Now, Kamala Harris made the comment that it was the most extraordinary story in history, and I wanted to stop and say, excuse me, it's only that extraordinary because the people who started it believed in a greater story than their own. They believed in the greatest story ever told. They didn't do this on a flat earth, secular, cultural, political. This was their faith. This was a manifestation. What they did was a manifestation of their deepest beliefs, and those beliefs were wholly in the context of the Judeo-Christian revelation of Scripture. Now, am I kind of getting that part right?
I'm quite sure you are, but let me say something. I think we shouldn't overthink what Harris has said. I think we should put it in context. And so let me do that for you. When I listened to the speech, my first reaction was beautiful, artfully crafted, highly articulate, delivered very well. Her timbre didn't get away from her. It had all the hallmarks of a well-produced, high-quality show. And it invoked the right terms. So when she refers to the most extraordinary human story, yes, she's echoing Johnson. She's echoing what I've taught for over 50 years. It was and is the most extraordinary story. So the real question is not whether she, in invoking it, has somehow neglected those antecedent struggles and affirmations that you're describing, beginning in 1609, but rather whether she means the same story that you're talking about. If you look at Rabbi Browse's closing benediction, she's telling you an extraordinary story, a story of recovery. She calls it redemption, but she really means recovery from the founding. That's what she's really talking about. And so she sees the extraordinary American story to be the story of overcoming American failure. You have to understand that. That's what the extraordinary story is that Kamala Harris has in mind. So she's using the right words. She's describing a different universe.
It's a bait and switch.
It's not unlike the speech of Barack Obama that put him in the national spotlight. And she was echoing that when she said, I'll be the president of all Americans. And he said, there's no white America, there's no black America, there's one America. All perfectly true, perfectly sound. And invoked in order, of course, to capture what he knows to be the heart of the country, but to do it without giving his heart to the country. And that's what you saw in Kamala Harris's reference to the extraordinary human story.
Let's take a break and let's come back. And when we do, let's read the actual prayer. It's very brief, but the prayer that was made by the rabbi at the Democratic Convention, because I think we want to pick up on that specifically and keep this frame of thought going.
And we will do that in just a moment here as you continue with us now on The Public Square, found online at thepublicsquare.com. And have you shared our smartphone app with someone? It's a great way to listen to this program. It's free in the App Store, The Public Square.
Right back for more on The Public Square.
So glad to have you with us today here on The Public Square. I often mention the website, thepublicsquare.com, but we also have a website known as aproundtable.org. Lots of helpful information there as well. So check that out anytime you're online, aproundtable.org. Okay, let's return to the studio and pick up today's conversation on The Public Square.
Rob, you've got the rabbi's prayer. Would you mind reading it for us? Again, it's very brief, but I think it's very important. And take your time. Just take it slow.
We have gathered together this week to craft a redemption story for America. My faith is sustained by a redemption story. A people beleaguered and bereft, traversing the desert on a journey from degradation to dignity, from darkness to light. Holy One, help us write America's redemption story, a story of ceaseless striving towards a true multiracial democracy, rooted in equal justice where every person is treated as unique, mighty, and worthy of love. In this story, politics is not a vehicle for repression, bigotry, or personal profit, but a call to service. This story counters extremism with capaciousness and compassion. It rejects the inevitability of war, affirming that every one of us, Muslim and Jew, Christian, Black, White, Latino, AAPI, queer and straight, Israeli and Palestinian, deserves to live in dignity and in peace. Some say that this story is impossible, but we know that the God of redemption specializes in the impossible, and so must we. May we be guided by hope, joy, and a fierce moral imagination. Amen.
Dr. Allen, can I ask you to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, this is an example of what I was talking about. Namely, the redemption story is the story of recovery from the sins of the past. And the sins of the past are the sins that were entailed by the founding of the United States. So that all of the convention's emphasis on our great story is not an emphasis on our great founders. That's something that has to be understood. We are recovering from these failed individuals who set us on a course of oppression. And the extraordinary story is how we are fighting through that oppression to create what the rabbi invokes as a great multicultural democracy or multiracial or whatever she used, democracy.
If you'll forgive me, I want to take a snap poll right here. I've read this prayer multiple times, and I knew something was desperately wrong. I tripped over the first sentence. I never got to the analysis that Dr. Allen has just brought to the table, which rings brilliantly clear when he says it. Allen, did this catch you as news?
Well, I hadn't thought of it in that light.
Okay. Rob?
I got hung up on the line that said, in this story, politics is not meant for personal profit. I wondered if she was aware of the other people on the stage that evening.
Right. To me, it's hard to hear a prayer about redemption without mentioning Jesus Christ. But obviously, this person is coming from a Jewish perspective that hasn't yet accepted that revelation.
Yeah, I was prepared for that because, I recognize that the story of the Old Testament and New Testament are both stories of redemption. All right, they're the same story, so to speak. So I was okay there. Melanie, is this news to you in your thinking?
Totally.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, this is all news.
Okay.
Got a lot of comments about it.
Well, sure, but we do this for a living, and we're like, wow, wait a minute. Whoa, thank God he's our trustee. Whew, boy, we needed some help. If we missed it, how many other people missed it? Which brings me to this point of, if I'm hearing this correctly, what I saw, what I witnessed, and Doc, I have to agree with you. I thought that Kamala Harris's speech was brilliant. First off, it was 29 minutes, for which I actually almost got on my knees and thanked God that somebody finally delivered a political speech in under 30 minutes. Hallelujah. Okay, that was a big one for me, and it was brilliantly delivered. I also saw John Favreau on Jesse Waters' program, I think it was the night before, so I knew that Favreau was around. Not the Favreau from the Avengers. This is the Favreau who wrote Barack Obama's second inaugural address, which we basically deconstructed, and it was exactly that kind of rhetorical exercise where Obama was saying one thing with the words we're all familiar with, but meaning something completely different. And so we broke it down, and then we were able to see it. This is that kind of speech, isn't it?
That is exactly right.
She's using one set of language, but it's code.
Well, it's code in a sense that perhaps escapes us still, because the purpose of the code is to let us fill in the blanks with what we know, and then give her the credit for what we know, so that she uses these. What word should we use? She uses these signposts. That's the best way to think of it.
Great term.
And as if you're on a journey, and you never bother to say what the landscape is, whether it's undulate or whether it's tree covered. You just say, "Oh, there's a landscape," and then your auditor says, "Oh, I know what a landscape is," and fills it in. And that's what's being done with our past. She's naming the signposts and allowing us to fill in the meanings that we attribute, and then to give her the credit for confirming them when she has no intention of doing so.
She keeps using terms about where the car's heading, and she's driving, but it's not heading there at all.
Exactly.
So we say to her, we want to go to X location. She said, oh, yeah. And then So we're being driven here by a narrative, but we're not talking about the same thing. A is not A. B,
precisely.
Okay. A is not A, B is not B. This is some. Now, I don't know who wrote the speech. One of our goals is to find out who wrote the speech. They did a great job as far as the speech goes.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, once again, this feels like deception at the deepest level.
Well, it's deception, it's rhetoric, it's demagoguery. You could call it any number of things. It's, of course, what often happens in statesmanship, where you have to invoke, as it were, sentiments before you can make principles effective. because you don't convince mass audiences with carefully reasoned arguments. I mean, that's long since been understood. So what do? You use symbolism. You use vague generalities. You use anything at all that can get people to embrace the result without having to make the journey through every step of the process.
Let's go back to the 1619 Project for a second. How in the world can the people at the New York Times who were so vested in that project, and that came across your desk while you were out lecturing, across your podium while you were out lecturing at universities all over the country? I mean, this was a big thing.
Sure.
The 1619 Project was everywhere, and how in the world could it have not had any role to play? And I guess I'm just baffled. I'm sorry. Help me out. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too much of a white guy. I just don't get how something could be so adamantly contended, and then at the moment of the political apex of this opportunity with the Democrat convention, disappear altogether. And I'm thinking to myself, the New York Times is in the room.
Sure, but remember, they don't want to die on that hill. But they're fighting a culture war, and they understand that politics is upstream from culture, not downstream. And therefore, they're perfectly willing to be quiet in the political season in order to preserve the opportunity to work the cultural change gradually. So they're not going to confront it at the moment of an election with a full-scale assault on cultural sensibilities. What they want to do is first establish themselves in authority and then continue the gradual assault on the culture.
Okay, there was a boom on my notes. Could we go back for people who are following along and haven't yet decided to take notes? Politics is upstream from culture. Could you explain that a little bit more?
What I mean to say is simply that what we find in politics is the open blossom, not the roots, not the first stirrings of green energy, but the open blossom when everything is fully developed. And the cultural basis, the cultural foundation, is where the roots are laid and the plant germinates and grows to the point that it can produce blossoms. That's what it means to say politics is upstream from culture. It's saying the flower is upstream from the roots.
So they're saying what they have to say to get what they want to get accomplished.
Correct. Do not we all?
This may be elementary, but is that what was meant when, I believe it was Abraham Lincoln, this is a paraphrase, that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of government in the next, where you sow those cultural roots and seeds young and deep.
Yes.
And then that blossoms into the political policies and principles, et cetera.
We certainly see that in Germany in the 1940s.
Yeah, that's very true, Melanie. But I will tell you, it wasn't Lincoln, interestingly enough. It was Robert Maynard Keynes who made that observation.
For our listeners, Dr. Allen, this is like a Rob Walgate moment. Well,
I know who that is, but just in case some listeners may not, can you let us know who that is?
Well, we all remember, of course, that Keynes was the early 20th century founder of modern economic analysis that leads us up to industrial policies and macroeconomic manipulation of the economy.
So to say he was an anchor in liberal economics, if you will, or maybe liberal isn't the right term, but certainly not conservative economics.
Keynesian was a name that was officially established, Keynesian economics.
Yes. And he was the person who made that first statement.
Yeah, that is correct.
All right, we're going to come back and we're going to have more conversation with Dr. Allen on this very question.
It's always a treat to have Dr. Allen with us here on the Public Square. We always learn so much, don't we? Well, you stay tuned, and we will come back, as Dave said, and talk more about these matters.
spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the public square.
On this edition of the Public Square, the team is joined by Dr. William B. Allen. Great conversation today. If you'd like to listen again, you can do so online at thepublicsquare.com. All right, let's turn back to the conversation now.
Doc, let's take a couple of minutes and talk about the Associated Press story by Ted Anthony. And let me first state Mr. Anthony's identifiers at the end of the article. It's not a very long article. It's out at ABC News in multiple places. Ted Anthony is defined, according to the Associated Press, as Director of News Storytelling and Newsroom Innovation at the Associated Press. He's been writing about American culture and politics for 35 years. He wrote this particular article in which he basically said, behind the rhetoric, a presidential campaign is a competition about how to tell the American story. I wanted to get my eraser out and say how to sell the American story, but then I realized it was kind of a little bit of both. I was fascinated that the Associated Press was as transparent as they were in basically saying what they said, that this is really a show and tell kind of situation. And the Associated Press seemed to be embracing it and joining in it quite a bit. Now, you've seen endless political campaigns. Can you reflect on that whole concept of this rhetorical storytelling? Are we just doing the same thing we've always done? Is there something different happening?
Oh, there's a lot different. At least if you think about it from the point of view of the newsroom. I can never forget that when I was still in college, I wrote copy for on-air anchors at a radio station, which meant I would take the leads coming in from AP and UPI and put them into the appropriate structure that people could understand hearing them over the air and not seeing them, because sometimes the sentences are too long. One thing or the other, all kinds of things affected it. But in those days, what AP and UPI did was what Dick Tracy would say, just the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. Well, we've long since gotten beyond that. For one thing, people don't just read AP and UPI copy anymore. UPI no longer even exists. And therefore, they got into the business of telling stories in general. That's what they regard journalism to be, storytelling. It's true of the major newspapers and the major outlets. So everything now is called constructing a narrative. That's storytelling. And that's why you hear that word narrative used so often. And so what AP is doing is what has become the new profession. Since the facts hardly matter in the news environment anymore, even in the fact-checking environment, what matters is, can you put together a compelling story that will prevail in the contemporary discourse, whatever the discourse of the moment is? Your task is to write the story that gives it its color and its structure. So, yes, it's storytelling from their point of view because that's the business they're in. And what do political conventions, political parties, and candidates do except feed the beast?
I've got to ask you the question about the need for a new redemptive story. I tripped over that one hard. I fell flat on my face on that one. As much as I treasure the American story, the story that I treasure personally the most, and I think everyone around this table in this organization feels much the same, is the true redemption story, the story of God revealing himself to humanity as recorded in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. That's the only redemption story that I know that is actually redemptive, that reaches the objective. I was excited to hear a rabbi talking about redemption because I think that is a common theme that Christians and Jews can talk about, and that has tremendous value. But it seemed, I don't know, Doc, I tripped flat on my face over it thinking, wait a second, a hymn started jumping in my mind. Tell me the old story. I started thinking about Jeremiah, search for the ancient paths. You've decoded this already for us in the immediate. Is there any more there we should be aware of?
Well, you're quite right. It's not reinvocation of I love to tell the story. That's not what it's about anymore. It's telling a new story. She emphasizes the new redemption. Substitute for redemption revelation, and you get closer to the truth of what the rabbi is talking about. She says, we are writing a new revelation. So that this is not the high priestly prayer from John 17 that takes the old redemption story and shows it in its full consummation, that's there before us. This is something to replace that, a new revelation. So that Christ's warning to beware of false prophets is what you should have in mind as you listen to this prayer.
I'm mindful of something I read in John Paul II's book, Threshold of Hope, in which he states that all that God had to say, he said in the person of Jesus Christ.
Correct.
Now, I'm paraphrasing it. He says it even more briefly and more eloquently than that. But the point is that the revelation of God on earth, the consummation of all of this, and Old Testament, New Testament, is found in this person. This person unlocks the door to the entirety of the story. And I'm still working on that part of the truth gathering in life. And I'm running out of time, and I'm feeling like I've got a long way to go. And now here someone comes along and says, I got a deal, let's have a new story. I'm thinking, wait a second, we've forgotten the old story. And then it makes me ask myself the question, is it genuinely a redemption story? Or is she really talking about a way that we can redeem ourselves? I mean, is the transcendence removed from this equation? We're creating our own redemption story. Is that it?
Well, I'm going to say something to you that, and the audience may find a bit challenging and out of all context, but I have been mulling over for the last few weeks an insignificant question, not unrelated to the Pope's book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope. And that is what it means actually to embrace Christ and the last revelation. And that means in terms of the character of love, Christ's love for humankind, for the world. And what I discovered in reflecting upon it is that human life is a journey from the moment of birth, where we're completely self-consumed. We have no consciousness other than consciousness of ourselves at the moment at the infant suckling at the breast. But we have a journey from being self-beloved to the love of others and the love of the creation, as the Pope expressed it. And we're not mature until we're completely liberated from self-love and completely absorbed in the love of creation. Now, when you think about it in that way, the last revelation is the account of the fullest possible human maturity. So what could a new revelation offer? Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at the enumeration that Rabbi Brous presents for us, all of which are derived from what we call identity politics. What is identity? Except to focus on the self, re-intensifying the self-beloved, rather than liberating the self-beloved for the full maturity of Christian love. That's what the rabbi's prayer was doing.
It falls short.
It crashes and burns.
It crashes. It crashes and burns. We cannot. The Pope in that book also spoke about the fact that not only can we not save ourselves, but the earth cannot save us. Yes. Because we and it, the creation, are both fallen. Therefore, we cannot be saved by that which has fallen. We need a redeemer.
We have been redeemed. I want to emphasize that. We have been redeemed.
Amen.
Well, when we come back, Jeff, we got to get to your question, and particularly now we're on the subject of redeemed and redemption. I want to get to that too. Okay. So we'll be right back.
Yeah, I hate to stop when Jeff's got his hand in the air, but we will come back to your point in just a moment, Jeff, here on the Public Square. Thanks for your support of the American Policy Roundtable and this program, which wouldn't be here without listeners who got behind it. So again, thank you so much. More coming up. moment ago here in the public square, Dr. Jeff Sanders was about to ask a question or make a comment. And Jeff, we want to take that break and get out of the way to give you lots of time. So go ahead, Jeff.
Well, actually, I have two comments. One's about the first sentence in the prayer, and then at the very end, the last phrase she uses, and they're connected. I mean, I think the whole prayer sounds good. I think it's a bunch of political drivel because of all these loaded terms that no one ever defines. It's left for us the individual to define. But redemption, in the New Testament, one of the words for redemption is apolutrosis, or apolutrao. The verb means to buy out of the marketplace. And it was usually used of a slave, to buy out of the marketplace and never to be sold again. Well, we've been redeemed. If you're a Christian, you've already been redeemed. You've been bought out of the marketplace of sin. But if you want to talk about our nation, and slavery was not there from the very beginning. The very beginning is 1607, Jamestown, and they did not have slaves in 1607. That would have been 1619. But if you want to talk about slavery being the original sin of America, we were redeemed. We had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which eliminated involuntary servitude. And then you have the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Acts of 1964-65. So they're talking about something else, some other kind of redemption, if you want to talk about giving people full and equal rights, which I'm not so sure actually I am sure what they're talking about. But the last phrase is what gets me. A fierce moral imagination. Well,
those are amazing words.
Yeah, morals are not imagined. Morals are absolute, they are fixed, and they are revealed. They are not imagined by you and me. And if you imagine morals, you're going to get in a world of hurt.
Let's get Doc in on this, because Doc, I actually found I thought that was incredibly bold to pray for fierce moral imagination. I don't know what it means, but I thought it was brave.
Who's doing the imagining?
What do you think? Put it in context for us.
You've got to be kidding me, right? Those words are utterly vacuous. Utterly vacuous. Nobody should be thinking about them seriously. I mean, what does the word fierce mean? Give me a break. There's no content there. There's no there.
So it's vapid. We're now just using language.
Yes.
We're praying our way off the end of a bridge.
Isn't it equivalent to moral relativism? Where basically whatever you think is moral, whatever I think is moral is moral.
A whole lot of 20th century dictators thought that.
Okay, so help me out then. Then the whole premise of the idea that we are going to craft not just the redemption story, but I mean, this is just strange stuff. The whole concept of redemption is that someone other than us intervenes on our behalf.
Yeah. This is the idea we're going to self-define. That's why I said it's just another iteration of identity politics. We're going to focus on ourselves. We're subjectively going to determine who we are and what our prospects are. And we are accountable to none other.
Now, some people listening are going to say, why are you driving? First off, most people in America by far did not watch this convention. And the people who did watch it didn't listen. They weren't tuned in for the invocations or the benedictions. I mean, they were just like they weren't there. We've just dragged up something that's obscure. Well, hang on a second. They prayed at this thing.
All of it was planned.
All right, everything was scripted. They prayed. Mm-hmm. They called upon the Holy One. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that means in their direction, but they at least were positioning themselves to say they were praying. Mm-hmm. And if they recorded their prayers, put them in writing, and pronounced them in that fashion, how can you not take that seriously? In other words, every time we turn around, anytime a Christian makes a comment in the marketplace, they're attacked for being a Christian nationalist and having an agenda. Here's the agenda of the prayer.
Yes, you're exactly right. They use all the symbols of American piety, just as they use the symbols of American patriotism. Remember, they were chanting USA, USA. The same people who looked at crowds that chanted USA, USA before and considered them to be yahoos. The symbols of piety, the symbols of patriotism is what they used. They did not use piety and patriotism.
So the same people that celebrated Kaepernick were actually now celebrating a football coach and having his team out there all right, with the Marine theme behind them. Why, I don't know that, but in other words, everything was upside down. Everything we've been told for the last 10 years seemed to be upside down.
It was all 1984. It was all Orwell in 1984.
It was Orwellian. Anything
Yes.
in the name of the pursuit of power.
Yes.
Because from positions of power, we can change the culture.
Correct.
Now, to be fair, I did watch a good portion of the Republican National Committee as well, and I don't necessarily believe that the rhetoric they're using there is connected to reality either.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's plenty of criticism that can go all the whole way around. Now, if I'm comparing just the two of them, I'm a lot more comfortable with what I heard the prior convention than I am at the latter. I was able to say amen to Franklin Graham's prayer at the Republican National Convention. But at the same time, I recognize that there is a competition in the Republican Party over some of these very same questions. Is it just a matter of degrees, Doc, or is at this stage, do you see a substantive difference?
Well, I just think it's a difference already to say there's a competition within the Republican Party. I think it's fair to say there's no competition within the Democrat Party. That there's fairly uniform approach to these questions. In the Republican Party, yes, there's still some division of sentiment about the relevance of religious piety and the direction from which it ought to be taken. That's why people still speak about evangelicals as an example and distinguishing them from all the other people who are also present in the party. You think that there are some fault lines, if you want to call it that, which distinguish them one from another. That turns out not to be the case in the Democrat Party to any significant degree. So in that sense, they're different. They're very different.
Well, that's a profound distinction. What advice would you give people that are trying to figure this out?
Be patient. Pay attention. Don't despair. These things are up and down. There's a sense in which it's not ours to call. It is ours to pray, but not ours to call. And being mindful of that is very important. And also, I think we mustn't be carried away with the media reactions. That's the most important thing. The media will tell us that there is a wave that's been created and that's going to wash over the whole society. Don't believe it. Don't believe it.
Another excellent point by our guest, Dr. William B. Allen. He'll have more to say as Dave has a question for him next here on the Public Square. A few of you listening to stations that have to cut away now may need to join us for the rest of the program online at thepublicsquare.com.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
As we often remind you, these conversations on the Public Square are not rehearsed, but we have a very thoughtful team, and let's return to them now. Here again is Dave Zanotti.
Doc, I want to ask you one more question. We're going to take criticism for this conversation, and we're open to it. This is a very raw discussion. We are really wrestling with this and trying to get it right. Now, we've been at it for a long time, not as long as you, and not at the levels of depth where you've been. And that's why we have such respect for your scholarship. Not only is it deep in regards to learning and teaching, but it's incredibly deep in regards to practice. I need to mention to people that you have been on the ground, whether it's a school board chairman or a hospital board chairman or working at in the Reagan administration with the Reagan administration on things like the EEOC or the Civil Rights Commission. You have been in public service as well as in instruction and in academics. You know this stuff. You've got the dirt under your fingernails. You've been there. And we have a great amount of respect for that. Most people, however, right now just want to get to the voting. They just want to cut the story. Let's go. Let's get done. We're over with this. And why don't you guys just stay with the stuff that matters? Talk about the issues that are going to change people's minds. And then they come up with their list. And we're pretty quickly now kind of in the cable news silo of battling and blowing back and forth across each other with what issue and so on to try to move people's opinions. You've said things today that speak deeply to all of us because this is bigger than politics. This is about truth. This is about eternity. This is so much bigger than politics. How is it that America is bigger than politics?
That's an interesting question. I would like to divide your question into two sections. The first section I would say is the question of whether we should be anxious, because that's what lays at the back of much of what you're saying. And I say no, we needn't be anxious. We can rest. We know we're in the midst of throes of change, and we can't predict what the outcome is going to be, but we also needn't panic about it. In the long scope of human history, one thing we must always remind ourselves is that there's no such thing as a nation that goes to heaven. I'm going to repeat that. There's no such thing as a nation that goes to heaven. And so our fate beyond this earth is for each of us, not for our country. It is no surprise that countries come and go. Yes, the really great ones have centuries of existence, but they do fail. We mustn't be anxious about that. Now, on the other hand, from a strictly political point of view, to take the second half of your question, we probably ought to relax a little bit. And as I said before, not buy into the story that we're going to be overwashed by a great wave, red or blue. Because the reality is that the trends that we see and that we can fairly easily anticipate are very, very narrow. Forget about the opinion polls. They're going to say, was there a bump from the convention? Was there not a bump from the convention? The reality at present is we are going through a political season in which there's not going to be room to develop those issues you want to talk about. We already have a truncated campaign, and it's being deliberately run to be even more truncated. The Harris campaign is going to stay away from the public as much as possible. And it's not until after the debate on the 10th that the real campaign will open. And at that point, you only have a month left to the middle of October for any real campaigning. They are going to run Biden in the basement pandemic campaign with a candidate who is not mentally defective or subject to great pandemic diseases. They figure it worked in one case, it can work in another. And so we have to face the reality of what the nature of this campaign is going to be like. And it is going to be a campaign that denies the public access to any real thinking, any real argument, any outlines of policy beyond those that have already been introduced. On the side of Trump, you will get more of that, of course, because he's a challenger, he's the outsider. But nevertheless, you're still not going to get any robust development of policy. There's not much point of asking for it at this stage of the game. Finally, forget the polls. They aren't telling us any more now than they did 8 years ago or 4 years ago. And if you want a poll that is instructive with respect to these two candidates and their prospects, get the informal poll by comparing the Nielsen ratings of their acceptance addresses. That'll probably be the best poll you can have going into this election campaign.
Doc, that's some of the best advice I've heard in a long time, and I appreciate it. We focus here on every level of the political discussion and the process that we can because we're a public policy organization. And you've come alongside to help us immensely in that, and I'm very, very appreciative. We don't forget how pivotal the fundamental ideas are. Now, we have a vested interest because we're Americans. We have a vested interest primarily, but first, because we're Christians and we're called to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And if the ideas we were hearing actually could be proven, could be tested, had a track record of being more valuable, more helpful, more genuine, more truthful than the ideas we've seen being presented by other theories, we jump on what works in the sense of what's really true and what's really helpful and what's really love. We debate these things based on a different set of values, not will it get me elected? Will it get me votes? It's what's right, what's just, what really does open the portal for love of neighbor. Most people just continue to degrade that and say, good Lord, just get on the one wagon or the other. You've been fighting for these ideas your whole life. I'm just going to ask you. I mean, everybody knows you're kind of toward the end of this journey. Is it worth it? Is that fight worth it?
There's nothing more worthy. Of the powers that move the world, the greatest of these is love. Seeing that to the end is the consummation of what it means to live. Nothing is more worthy.
What a great statement to bring to a conclusion this edition of The Public Square. And thanks for listening.
Love lifted me. Love lifted me. When nothing else could help. Love lifted me. Love lifted me. Love lifted me. When nothing else could help. Love lifted me.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.
Jesus saves, Jesus saves. He will lift you from the crashing waves.